On the afternoon of March 13th, 1758, in a frozen valley in the northern wilderness of New York, a man named Robert Rogers raised his musket, sighted along the barrel at a column of warriors crossing a sheet of ice, and fired a single shot. That shot was a signal. In the half-second that followed, 180 men rose out of the snow on the bank of a stream called Trout Brook and loosed a volley into the enemy below them. Roughly 40 men fell dead on the ice where they stood. It was, for 1 perfect minute, the most one-sided ambush of the entire war. By nightfall, more than half of Rogers' own command lay dead in that same snow. Think about that reversal. A force springs a flawless trap, kills 40 of the enemy in a single volley, and within the hour is being hunted to extinction across a mountainside. Its officers cut down, its wounded abandoned, its survivors scattering into a sub-zero forest to die of cold as much as of musket fire. Of the roughly 184 men who marched out onto the ice, 125 would never come back. Now hold that number in your mind, because 4 months later, in the summer of that same year, in the same stretch of wilderness, along the same brook, something far larger walked into the trees. 16,000 men, the single biggest army ever assembled on the North American continent up to that day. 900 boats, bagpipes echoing off the Adirondacks. An armada so vast that French scouts said they could not see the water of the lake between the shorelines. That army marched toward a French fort held by a force a quarter its size, and it was slaughtered so completely that the day would stand as the bloodiest single day of combat in North American history until the American Civil War, more than a century later. 2 catastrophes, the same corridor, the same brook, in the same few miles of wilderness, and a thread running between them that almost no one draws. This isn't legend dressed up as history. We have Robert Rogers' own journals, written in his own hand and published in London within a decade. We have the after-action reports of British officers, the correspondence of the Marquis de Montcalm, the meticulous embarkation records of the French regiments, and the recovered casualty rolls that let modern historians check the official numbers against the bodies actually found on the ground. When the accounts disagree, and on the numbers they often do, I'll tell you. Rogers, for instance, had every reason to inflate the enemy dead in his reports, and he did. The French had every reason to minimize their own losses, and they may have. History that survives through interested witnesses has to be read with a careful eye, and we'll read it that way. But here is what is not in dispute. In the space of a single year, in a single narrow gap between 2 lakes, British arms suffered 2 of the most humiliating defeats of the entire 7 Years' War. And the popular memory that fuses them into one story, a frozen lake ambush that destroyed a mighty army, gets the details wrong while stumbling onto something true. The 2 disasters are connected. The first made the second possible. By the end of this video, you're going to understand 3 things that the usual telling of this campaign leaves out. First, how the disaster on the frozen brook in March, where the British lost their finest scouts, was the first act of a campaign that would be undone again and again by the same fatal failure. The failure to see the enemy, to see the ground, to see the trap waiting in the trees. These weren't 2 unrelated defeats. They were the first and second acts of the same tragedy on the same brook. Second, why a general standing at the head of 16,000 men, with siege cannon, with high ground available, with every material advantage warfare can offer, chose to throw his infantry, unsupported, without firing a single gun, into the one obstacle they could not overcome. This was not bad luck. It was a decision, and we can reconstruct exactly how it was made. Third, how 3/4 of a mile of felled trees, an obstacle built by exhausted men in a single day and a night, killed more soldiers in 6 hours than any battle fought on this continent would kill until the American Civil War. The weapon that broke the British Army at Carillon was not a musket or a cannon. It was the forest itself. And along the way, the questions keep multiplying. How does a war party get annihilated by a single volley, and then, minutes later, annihilate the men who fired it? Why did the French, outnumbered more than 4-1, low on food, wearing the rags of last year's uniforms, choose to stand and fight in the open instead of hiding behind their fort's stone walls? What did a Highland major hear whispered to him in a Scottish castle years before this campaign? A single foreign word he didn't understand that made him turn ashen at the sight of an American lake. And why, after the smoke cleared and the largest army on the continent had been broken by a force it should have crushed, did the victorious French commander raise not a monument to his own genius, but a wooden cross and give the credit to God? To answer any of it, we have to go back. Back before the boats, before the abatis, before the frozen brook. Back to a stretch of water the Mohawk called Ticonderoga, the place between the waters, because everything that happened here, every death in the snow and every death in the timber, happened because of what this ground was and where it sat and what two empires were willing to spend to hold it. By 1758, the war between Britain and France for the mastery of North America had been grinding on for 4 years, though it had not yet been formally declared when it began. It started, as these things often do, with an obscure skirmish in the deep woods. A bloody little affair at a place called Jumonville Glen in 1754, involving a young and untested Virginian officer named George Washington. From that spark, the fire spread across the entire globe, until Britain and France were fighting each other on 4 continents in what would come to be called the 7 Years' War. North America was only one theater of it, but it was the theater where the stakes were the whole continent. And on this continent, the war had a strange and specific shape, because the continent itself dictated it. Beyond the thin ribbon of British colonies clinging to the Atlantic seaboard, and beyond the scattered French settlements along the St. Lawrence, lay an ocean of forest. Primeval, trackless, all but impenetrable. An army could not simply march across it. There were no roads worth the name. Cannon and supply wagons and the tons of food an army devours every day could not be dragged through hundreds of miles of timber and swamp and mountain, which meant that whoever wanted to strike at the enemy's heartland had to travel by water. The rivers and the lakes were not scenery. They were the roads. They were the only roads. And the most important road of them all ran straight between the British colonies and the heart of New France. From the Hudson Valley, an army could move north to Lake George, cross its length, portage down to Lake Champlain, and sail Champlain's long finger of water directly toward the St. Lawrence and the cities of Montreal and Quebec. Reverse the direction, and the same corridor was a dagger pointed at the throat of the British colonies. The exact route French raiders and their native allies used to descend on the frontier settlements. Control this corridor, and you controlled the war in the north. Lose it, and you left your enemy a highway into your own home. So both empires poured blood into it, and in the years before 1758, that blood had mostly been British. The pattern of humiliation ran deep. In 1755, a British and colonial army under Major General Edward Braddock had been ambushed and shattered in the western wilderness near Fort Duquesne, its commander killed, its survivors streaming back in a rout that announced to everyone watching that European regulars could be broken by irregular warfare in the American woods. In 1756, the Marquis de Montcalm, the new commander of French regular forces in North America, captured and destroyed the British post at Oswego. And in 1757, Montcalm did something that would poison the war for a generation. He besieged and took Fort William Henry at the southern end of Lake George. And then, as the surrendered British garrison marched away under the terms of their capitulation, Montcalm's native allies fell upon the disarmed column and killed and captured hundreds in a massacre that neither Montcalm nor his officers could stop. The ruins of Fort William Henry became a grave and a grievance. The southern end of Lake George became a scorched, militarized no-man's land. By 1758, in other words, the corridor was a place where British armies came to be defeated. It was ground-soaked in a string of catastrophes, each one feeding the French belief that they were the masters of this country, and the British belief that they were fighting an enemy who somehow could not be beaten in the trees. Into that atmosphere of dread and grievance, both sides now prepared to send everything they had. And at the pivot of the corridor, at the exact hinge where Lake George empties into Lake Champlain, the French had built the thing the whole campaign would turn upon. Where Lake George ends, its waters do not simply flow into Lake Champlain. They fall. They rush down a short, violent river called the La Chute, the drop, the fall, tumbling through rapids toward Champlain's southern basin. And on the rocky peninsula beside that junction, on ground the Mohawk had named Ticonderoga, the place between the waters, the governor of New France ordered a fort raised in 1755 to bar the door. The man who designed it was a military engineer named Michel Chartier de Lotbinière, and he built according to the great European science of the age. The principles of Vauban, the French master of fortification whose star-shaped fortresses had made siege warfare into geometry. Fort Carillon, as the French called it, rose on its rocky outcrop with 4 bastions, arrowhead-shaped projections named Reine, Germain, Joannes, and Languedoc, angled so their defenders could sweep every approach with crossing fire. It began as walls of squared oak timber packed with earth, later dressed with limestone. Around it ran a dry moat 15 feet wide and 5 feet deep, a sloping glacis to expose attackers, and 2 half-moon outworks, demilunes, guarding the landward side. And around the fort, a whole small world grew up. There was a king's garden, the Jardin du Roi, laid out on the sandy flats to feed the garrison. There were barracks and hospitals, taverns and bakeries, an upper town and a lower town. For a few years, in the middle of a wilderness that swallowed men whole, there was something like a European town, complete with the smell of baking bread and the sound of a soldier's tavern. It looked, on the map and on the ground, like strength. It was not. Fort Carillon was a beautiful mistake. As the French cleared the old-growth forest around it for firewood and fields, their engineers made a sickening discovery. The fort had been placed too far to the east. It did not actually command the junction of the 2 lakes the way it was supposed to. The guns did not properly cover the very water they were built to control. The French had to scramble to throw up an auxiliary strongpoint, the Redoute des Grenadiers, closer to the shore, to plug the gap. Worse, the fort was overlooked. A nearby hill, Mount Defiance, sometimes called Sugarloaf, rose high enough that any enemy who dragged cannon to its summit could fire down into the fort's open interior at leisure. A fortress that can be looked down into is not a fortress. It is a stone box waiting for someone to notice. Montcalm himself saw all of this with a clear and unsentimental eye. He looked at Carillon, and he saw leaking powder magazines, poor masonry, walls that would crack under a serious siege train. He concluded, coldly and correctly, that the fort could never survive a proper conventional siege. If the British ever arrived in force with heavy guns and the patience to use them, the stone walls of Carillon would not save New France. Which raises the question that hangs over this entire campaign, the question Montcalm would have to answer with his life and the lives of his men. If the fort cannot hold, what does? Remember that question. It is the hinge of everything. But before we can watch Montcalm answer it in July, we have to go back to the dead of winter, to the frozen months when the lakes turned to roads of ice, and a different kind of war was fought in the dark and the snow. The war that would blind the British before their great army ever set sail. To understand what happened on the ice, you have to understand what winter meant in this place, in this century. The mid-1700s fell within a long climatic spell that historians call the Little Ice Age, a stretch of centuries when the northern world ran colder than it does today. In the wilderness of upstate New York, that meant winters of a severity that is difficult to convey. Sub-zero cold that could kill an unprotected man in a night. Snow that fell and did not melt, piling into drifts 4 feet deep and deeper, until the whole landscape became a trackless white ocean. And the lakes, Lake George, Lake Champlain, froze solid, hard enough to carry the weight of men and sleds, and in a grim irony, hard enough to become highways for exactly the kind of army that knew how to use them. Conventional European armies did not know how to use them. In the old world way of war, winter was simply the season when fighting stopped. Armies went into winter quarters. You could not drag artillery through 4 feet of snow. You could not feed thousands of men strung out across a frozen wasteland. So the professional soldiers of Britain and France, trained on the fields of Flanders and Germany, shut down operations and waited for spring, the way their grandfathers had. Their enemies did not wait. The French-Canadian militia and their native allies were creatures of this country in a way the redcoats never were. They lashed snowshoes to their feet and moved across the drifts where regulars would flounder and drown. They strapped on ice skates and covered the frozen lakes at speeds no marching column could match. And through the long dark of the northern winter, they came south, raiding the British frontier, burning farms, taking scalps and prisoners, striking and vanishing back into the white silence before any garrison could respond. Winter, for them, was not a pause. It was hunting season. The British had to answer this somehow, and their answer had a name: the Rangers. And the Rangers had a face: a hard, cunning, ambitious New Hampshire frontiersman named Robert Rogers. Robert Rogers understood something most British officers of his day could not bring themselves to accept: that the European way of war was suicide in the American woods, and that to beat the enemy at this game, you had to learn to fight the way he fought. Rogers raised and trained independent companies of provincial light infantry, men drawn from the frontier who could shoot, track, march, and survive in conditions that would kill a parade ground soldier. He drilled them in what he called ranging, moving silently, scouting, ambushing, melting away. He wrote down rules for it, plain and brutal and practical, and those rules would outlive him by centuries. And his Rangers were something genuinely unusual for an 18th century military force. A mongrel band, mixed in a way the rigid class and race hierarchies of the age did not usually permit. Their ranks held men of English, Irish, Scottish, Welsh, German, Dutch, and Portuguese descent. They included freedmen of African descent, carrying muskets as equals in the firing line. And they included entire companies of native warriors, Stockbridge Mohicans, Mohegans, and Pequots, whose skill at tracking and survival Rogers considered not a supplement to his force, but the indispensable heart of it. In a war soaked in racial atrocity on all sides, The Rangers were, by the standard of their century, a strikingly diverse instrument of violence. By 1758, these men were the eyes and ears of the entire British war effort in the North, operating out of Fort Edward on the Hudson and the ruins of Fort William Henry. It was Rogers' Rangers who went out into the frozen no-man's land to see what the French were doing, who counted the enemy, mapped the dispositions, and brought back the intelligence on which any future offensive would depend. If the British Army was a body preparing to march, the Rangers were its eyes. They had already learned, more than once, how unforgiving this kind of war could be. A year earlier, in January 1757, in the first of what would come to be called the battles on snowshoes, Rogers and 74 men had intercepted French supply sleds on the frozen surface of Lake Champlain. A larger French force gave chase, and the Rangers fought a desperate running battle through the fading light before breaking away into the dark. That fight taught a lesson the men never forgot. Out here, the weather was often as deadly as the enemy, and the margin between a clean escape and a frozen corpse could come down to the smallest thing: a fouled musket, a night that stayed just above killing cold. That was the world Rogers lived in. And in the late winter of 1758, with the great British summer offensive already being planned in distant war rooms, the High Command decided it needed to know exactly what waited for them at the far end of the frozen lake. They turned, as they always did, to Rogers, and they gave him an order that he would spend the rest of his life wishing he had refused. In late February 1758, Lieutenant Colonel William Haviland, the British commandant of Fort Edward, ordered Rogers to take a patrol north toward Fort Carillon and bring back intelligence on French strength and winter dispositions, ahead of the summer campaign everyone knew was coming. Rogers did not like it. He knew this ground, and he knew something Haviland seemed to discount: that his own operational security was already leaking. Colonial prisoners had recently been taken by the enemy near Fort Edward, and Rogers feared, correctly as it turned out, that the French already knew a patrol was coming and roughly where it would go. A scout whose approach is expected is a scout marching into a trap. So Rogers asked for numbers. "Give me 400 men," he said in effect, "enough to fight my way out if I'm discovered." Haviland refused. He cut the request down brutally, authorizing a force of only about 180 to 184 men, Rangers and a handful of regular volunteers. It was less than half of what Rogers judged the mission required, sent into country Rogers believed was already watched, for objectives the enemy could already guess. Rogers went anyway. That was the job. On March 10th, 1758, he led his detachment off Rogers Island, the strip of land in the Hudson beside Fort Edward that served as the Rangers' home, and turned north into the White. What followed was 3 days of pure physical ordeal before a single shot was fired. To cross the vast frozen sheet of Lake George, the men strapped iron cleats, ice creepers, to their boots to bite into the slick surface, their heavy wooden snowshoes lashed to their packs for the forest stretches. But the lake was a killing ground of a different sort. A flat white expanse with no cover for miles, where a moving column could be spotted from any shoreline or hilltop for miles around. So Rogers moved his men mostly by night, or hugged the eastern shore, hiding through the daylight hours in the dense stands of spruce and fir, and pushing on again when the dark came down. Every mile of it was exhausting in a way that is hard to imagine. The cold never let up. The packs were heavy, and underneath the physical grind ran a constant, gnawing dread, the certainty of experienced men that they were being watched, that somewhere out in the white silence, the enemy was pacing them, waiting. On the third day, that dread began to take shape. March 12th, the signs began to come. First, a dog, out on the frozen surface of the lake, the Rangers saw a dog running loose across the ice. To a frontier soldier, a stray dog in this emptiness was not a stray dog. It was a signal, the near certain marker of a native war party somewhere close, because where the warriors camped, their dogs ranged. Rogers pulled his men off the exposed ice and into the tree line without a word needed. Then, that evening, fire. An advance scout named Lieutenant Phillips came back with a report that he had seen a fire burning on the eastern shore. A fire meant men, and men in this country meant the enemy. Rogers sent a careful party to investigate, and they found nothing. No fire, no camp, no tracks. Rogers, a veteran of 100 nights in these woods, concluded the scout had been fooled by the dark, a patch of snow catching the moonlight, or rotting wood gone faintly luminous. The pale glow that decaying timber sometimes throws in the blackness, phosphorescent and ghostly, the kind of thing that has made frightened men see campfires and worse since the beginning of time. But whether the fire was real or imagined almost didn't matter. Between the dog and the fire, Rogers had made up his mind. The lake was being watched. To stay out on that open ice was to invite a bullet. So he made the fateful call. He ordered his men off the frozen lake entirely, told them to strap on their snowshoes, and led them into the deep, snow-choked forest of the western shore. Into the timber, where at least the trees would hide them. He was right that the lake was watched. He did not yet grasp how completely. Behind Rogers, the trap was already closing, and it had been set by the one thing he could not control, his own tracks. A party of French allied warriors, moving north, had crossed the trail his men had left. The deep, unmistakable furrows of 180 men on snowshoes, plowing out of the lake and into the western woods. You cannot hide the passage of that many men in 4 feet of snow. The trail may as well have been a signed confession. The warriors carried word straight to the French commander at Fort Carillon, Captain Debecourt. And Debecourt reacted with the speed of a professional who has just been handed a gift. He sent out 2 forces. Ahead went an advance element, roughly 95 to 100 warriors, mostly Iroquois and Nipissing, led by a young officer named Ensign Joseph de la Durantaye, moving fast along the frozen bed of Trout Brook toward the Rangers' trail. And about 15 minutes behind them came the hammer. A reaction force of more than 200 French Marines and Canadian militia, under the command of Ensign Jean-Baptiste de Langy. And this name matters, because Langy was not just any officer. He was among the most experienced and lethal partisan commanders in all of New France. A man who had spent years mastering exactly this kind of war, in exactly this kind of country. He was the wolf you did not want on your trail. And he was on Rogers' trail now. So picture the board as it actually stood on the morning of March 13th, though Rogers could see none of it. His 180 exhausted men were moving through deep snow. Coming toward them, unseen, was a fast-moving vanguard of 100 warriors. And 15 minutes behind that vanguard, unseen by anyone, was a second force larger than Rogers' entire command, led by one of the deadliest men on the continent. Rogers thought he was the hunter. He was walking into the middle of a hunt where he was the prey, and where the first contact would trick him into thinking he had won. That morning, Rogers pushed his force westward, circling behind Bald Mountain to slip past the French forward post he assumed was watching the direct route. The men waded through snow up to their thighs, and the strange, splayed, plodding gait that snowshoes force on a walking man drained them with every step. An exhaustion peculiar to that country and that season. The deep muscle fatigue of hours spent lifting weighted feet out of clinging drifts. By 3 in the afternoon, Rogers made a tactical decision. He turned his men down into the frozen valley of Trout Brook itself, intending to move along it set an ambush position for the night, and strike the enemy the following morning. He arranged his command in 3 parts. The standard ranging order. Captain Charles Bulkeley led the point element at the front, Rogers himself commanded the main body in the center, and Ensigns James White and Joseph Waite brought up the rear guard. And then his advance guard, moving down the brook, saw them, Duranty's warriors, coming up the ice. Rogers reacted with the reflexes of a master ambusher. Instantly, silently, the Rangers dropped their heavy packs into the snow and threw themselves into a hasty firing line along the bank of the brook, above and beside the enemy's line of march. They let the warriors come on, closer, closer, until the head of the enemy column drew level with their concealed position. Then Rogers fired his single shot, and the whole line erupted. The volley tore into Duranty's men at close range on open ice, where there was nowhere to hide and nothing to do but die. Dozens went down at once, roughly 40 killed in the space of a few heartbeats, cut apart by a wall of lead they never saw coming. The survivors did the only sane thing. They broke, turned, and fled back up the frozen brook in howling panic. And in that instant of triumph, Rogers' command destroyed itself. It is the oldest trap in the history of war, and the most human. The moment when a soldier stops being a soldier and becomes a hunter, drunk on victory. The Rangers had just annihilated the head of an enemy column. 40 of the enemy lay dead or dying on the ice, and the rest were running. To the men crouched on that bank, exhausted, terrified, and suddenly flooded with the wild relief of survival, it looked like the fight was already over. Like they had won a clean, total victory, and the only thing left to do was collect the reward. And so their discipline evaporated. A large body of Rangers broke from the firing line and rushed down onto the ice, some to scalp the dead, some to finish off the wounded, the grim harvest of frontier war. Others, led by Captain Bulkeley, gave chase to the fleeing survivors, plunging after them up the brook and into the trees, hungry to run the enemy down. They ran straight toward the 15-minute gap, straight toward Langy, because those fleeing survivors were not fleeing into empty forest. They were fleeing back into the arms of the 200-man reaction force, which had heard the volley and was already surging forward at speed toward the sound of the guns. The panicked warriors ran back through Langy's advancing lines, and Langy, a professional who understood in a glance exactly what was happening, did not hesitate. He deployed his Marines and militia into a broad battle line across the snow, faced the direction the pursuing Rangers were coming from, and waited for them to arrive. The Rangers arrived at a dead run, strung out, disordered, blood up, formation gone, and they ran headlong into a concentrated volley from more than 200 muskets at point-blank range. The shock was total. Captain Bulkeley and nearly every forward officer was killed or mortally wounded in that single fusillade. The men who should have held the pursuit together cut down in the first second of it. What had been a victorious pursuit became, instantaneously, a massacre of the pursuers. The survivors of the vanguard reeled back in total panic, and now it was the French and their allies who were doing the hunting, their fury sharpened by the sight, just behind them, of their own comrades freshly scalped on the ice. There is no mercy in a fight like that. There was never going to be. From the center, Rogers watched his own trap spring shut on his own men, and understood in an instant that his entire command was about to be destroyed. His vanguard was gone. The enemy, now reinforced, now enraged, now more numerous than his whole surviving force, was driving in hard, and Rogers could see his right flank beginning to bend and curl backward under the pressure. The first stage of a total envelopment. Once a force is surrounded in open snow, it stops being an army and becomes a killing pen. He had seconds to act before the trap closed completely. The fighting at this point defies the tidy diagrams of military history. This was combat at ranges of less than 20 yards. Muzzle flashes in the trees, men firing into each other's faces, and then, when there was no time to reload, closing with tomahawks and knives and clubbed muskets, swinging the heavy weapons like axes, grappling in the drifts. The snow churned and reddened, the air full of screaming in 2 or 3 languages. It was the most intimate and savage kind of killing, hand to hand in 4 feet of snow. And it was going against Rogers with every passing minute. He made the only decision that could save any of them. He ordered a fighting withdrawal, not a rout, a withdrawal, men falling back while still firing, up the steep slopes of Bald Mountain, toward the high ground, where the mountain itself would guard their backs and the slope would break the enemy's numbers. It was the correct call, made under conditions where most men would simply have died. And it bought his survivors 90 more minutes of life on the high ground, with the mountain at their rear. Rogers managed to rally roughly 120 men, many of them wounded, all of them exhausted, low on powder, ringed by an enemy that outnumbered them and smelled the end coming. And there, on that frozen slope as the light began to fail, the Rangers made their stand. For an hour and a half, they held. Wave after wave of French and native assaults came up the slope, and wave after wave was thrown back by disciplined fire from men who knew that surrender in this fight likely meant death anyway. But numbers are numbers, and the perimeter was shrinking. Out on one edge of it, Ensign Joseph Waite and the 10 men of the rear guard were cut off entirely. Surrounded, overwhelmed, and killed in the snow, unable to reach the main body. One by one, the strong points of the defense were crushed. And as dusk thickened and the last cartridges were counted, Rogers understood that the perimeter could not hold through the night. So he gave the final order of the battle, and it was an order of despair and hard sense both. Scatter. Break apart into small groups of 2 and 3, he told them, and run. Flee through the darkening woods, each little band on its own, back toward Lake George, following the ranging protocols they had all been trained in for exactly this nightmare. A command that cannot survive together might survive dispersed. It was the last card he had, and he played it. And then the battle on snowshoes dissolved into 100 separate stories of men trying not to die in the dark. What came after the battle was, for many of the survivors, worse than the battle. Consider 2 officers, Captain Pringle and Lieutenant Roche, who escaped the melee into the freezing night, but escaped without their coats and blankets, torn away or discarded in the fighting. Then their snowshoes broke. Without snowshoes, in that snow, a man sinks to his waist with every stride, and every 50 paces becomes its own small war against the drifts. For 5 days these 2 wandered, lost in a freezing rain that coated their bodies in a shell of ice. To keep from freezing to death in the nights, they could not sleep. They stomped an endless circular path around a tree, hour after hour, keeping the blood moving in their limbs by the simple animal necessity of not stopping. They ate bark. They ate berries scraped from under the snow. And when at last they staggered back to the shore of Lake George, they watched their own guide sit down in the snow, too spent to go on, and quietly die of exposure in front of them. In the end, Pringle and Roche surrendered themselves to the French, because being a French prisoner was survivable, and freezing to death in the wilderness was not. And then there is Rogers' own escape, which passed almost immediately out of history and into legend. The story goes that Rogers, pursued to the edge of a sheer 400-foot precipice that fell away to the frozen lake below, threw down his uniform coat, with his officer's commission still in the pocket, strapped his 2 snowshoes together, and slid down the smooth, near-vertical face of frozen rock to the ice at the bottom, escaping clean. That cliff is called Rogers Rock, or Rogers Slide to this day. Did it happen that way? Almost certainly not, at least not literally. The more sober and more tactically convincing reconstruction is that Rogers reversed his snowshoes, turning them so the tracks pointed backward. Walked backward to the cliff edge to plant a false trail suggesting he had gone over, and then slipped down a nearby ravine to the ice and away, leaving his pursuers to puzzle over footprints that seemed to end at a lethal drop. Either way, the French, finding his abandoned coat and commission papers at the cliff's edge, briefly believed they had killed the famous Rogers and reported his death to Montcalm. It was not the last time an enemy would be premature in writing him off. Strip away the folklore and the sensory horror, and here is the cold, strategic arithmetic of the battle on snowshoes. Of the roughly 184 men who marched out onto the ice, 125 were killed and 7 were captured. It was, by any measure, a catastrophe for British arms. Most of a command wiped out in an afternoon. The French, for their part, officially reported losing only 6 killed and 24 wounded across both their forces, despite absorbing that devastating opening volley on the brook. That number strains belief, and it should. Rogers, in his own reports, wildly inflated the enemy dead to salvage his reputation. And the truth of French losses very likely sits somewhere above their official tally and well below Rogers' boast. As with so much of this war, the real figure is lost in the gap between two interested witnesses. But the casualty count, however you resolve it, is not the whole of it. The Rangers were the eyes of the British Army, the men who could see this wilderness clearly when the regulars could see almost nothing at all. And on that frozen brook, 125 of the most experienced of them were killed in an afternoon. Rogers himself survived to rebuild his companies, and rebuilt Ranger companies would march with the great summer expedition 4 months later. So it would be too much to say the Army went north with no eyes at all, but something had been broken that a fresh muster could not simply replace. A corps of veteran woodsmen, and more than that, any illusion that the British had learned how to see in this country. Twice now the corridor had taught the same lesson in blood, that the deadliest thing an army could do here was move into ground it could not see, against an enemy who saw it first. In March, that mistake cost a patrol. And in July, on nearly the same ground, along the same brook, it would cost an empire its greatest army on the continent. Because the men leading that army were about to make the very same mistake, on a scale beyond imagining. Which is exactly what the summer had in store. While the snow melted off the corpses on Bald Mountain, the war changed, not in America, but in London. A single man seized the British war effort and bent it to his will. William Pitt, the new Prime Minister, a figure of towering ambition and ferocious clarity, who looked at the sprawling, faltering global war and decided that Britain would not merely defend her colonies, but would destroy France's empire outright and take North America whole. Pitt poured money and men across the Atlantic on a scale never before seen. And for 1758, he designed a 3-pronged offensive meant to shatter New France in a single season. An amphibious assault on the great fortress of Louisbourg, guarding the mouth of the St. Lawrence. A thrust west against Fort Duquesne to redeem the ghost of Braddock's disaster. And in the center, the hammer blow, a massive drive straight up the Lake George-Lake Champlain corridor to take Fort Carillon, break open the gateway, and march on Montreal. It was the central thrust, the hammer, that would decide the fate of the North, and the question of who would swing it would decide the fate of thousands of men. Pitt made 2 appointments. The first was a catastrophe, the second was a miracle. And the tragedy of Carillon is contained entirely in the fact that the catastrophe outlived the miracle by a single day. To command the entire British force in North America and to lead the central thrust in person, Pitt appointed Major General James Abercrombie. Abercrombie was 52 years old, a career officer whose rise owed far more to political patronage and the slow escalator of seniority than to any spark of military brilliance. His own soldiers, the colonials in particular, who did not bother to hide their contempt, mocked him behind his back with a nickname that says everything: Nabby-Crombie. He was seen by men who served under him and men who observed him as unimaginative, lethargic, physically and mentally sluggish, and utterly unsuited to the demands of wilderness war. James Wolfe, the general who would soon become immortal on the Plains of Abraham at Quebec, dismissed him in a letter to his father as a heavy man. And a teenage soldier in the Massachusetts ranks put it more cruelly still, describing him as an aged gentleman, infirm in body and mind. This was the man Pitt placed at the head of the largest army in the history of the continent. But Pitt was not a fool, and he understood Abercrombie's limits well enough to try to insure against them. So he made a second appointment, and in it he came very close to saving everything. As second in command, Pitt sent Brigadier General George Augustus, the 3rd Viscount Howe. And Lord Howe was, in nearly every particular, the exact opposite of the man he served under. Howe was 33 years old, and he was the kind of soldier other soldiers would follow into fire without being asked twice. Dynamic where Abercrombie was sluggish, brilliant where Abercrombie was dull, beloved, genuinely, deeply beloved, by regulars and provincials alike in an army where those 2 groups usually despised each other. Pitt had in fact wanted Howe, not Abercrombie, to lead the whole expedition, and been overruled only by seniority and political connection. Wolfe, who had no patience for Abercrombie, called Howe the noblest Englishman that has appeared in my time, and the best soldier in the British Army. Within weeks of his arrival, Lord Howe had become the true operational soul of the army, the mind that planned, the will that drove, the heart the men fought for. Abercrombie held the rank. Howe held the army. And Howe understood the one thing that Abercrombie never would: that this country demanded a new way of war. Lord Howe had looked clear-eyed at the string of British disasters in the American woods and drawn the correct and radical conclusion: the rigid, gorgeous, linear tactics of the European battlefield, the massed ranks, the parade ground precision, the heavy uniforms and gleaming equipment, were not just useless in the dense North American forest. They were a death sentence. Braddock had proved it in blood. The trees did not care how straight your line was. So Howe did something almost unheard of for a British aristocrat. He went to school under a colonial frontiersman. He accompanied Robert Rogers himself on scouting patrols, learning the irregular bush-fighting arts firsthand. And he treated the provincial soldiers, usually regarded by British regulars as little better than armed peasants, as partners and equals, dissolving the poisonous animosity between the 2 halves of his army. And then he took what he had learned and remade the regular army in its image, using his own 55th Regiment of Foot as the prototype for a revolution. The changes were sweeping, and to the traditionalists they must have looked like sacrilege. Howe had the long, heavy skirts of the famous red coats sheared off at the waist, turning them into short, practical jackets. He stripped away all the decorative lace that could snag and catch in the underbrush. He had the wide tricorn hats, useless in the timber, cut down to a mere 2.5 inches of brim, blunt little caps that let a man see to the sides and move through branches. He issued thick wool leggings in place of thin linen gaiters to armor the men's legs against the tearing brush. And in the change that most scandalized the traditionalists, he ordered his soldiers to brown the bright, shining barrels of their muskets, to deliberately dull the proud gleam of British steel, because that gleam was a flash of light that told the enemy exactly where you were. The logistical discipline was just as ruthless. Howe ordered the men to cut their long hair short, prompting one army doctor to remark, half in wonder, that they had become an army of round heads. He banned heavy baggage outright, 1 blanket and a bearskin per man, and nothing more, no sashes, no dress swords, none of the accumulated clutter of European soldiering. He even forbade the women who traditionally followed the camp to do the washing. And crucially, he did none of it by decree from a comfortable tent. Howe led entirely by example. He cut his own aristocratic hair. He washed his own clothes in the river alongside his men. He stripped his own general's tent down to a single blanket. An earl's son, living rough as a common ranger, and the army loved him for it beyond all reason. By the summer of 1758, Lord Howe had forged something genuinely new. A British regular army with the discipline of professionals and the agility of frontiersmen. The first real answer the British had produced to the French way of war in the woods. It was, potentially, war-winning. Everything depended on the man who had built it staying alive long enough to use it. By late June 1758, Abercrombie's host had gathered at the southern end of Lake George, on the ashes of murdered Fort William Henry. And the sheer size of it staggered every man who saw it. Roughly 16,000 men. It was, without exaggeration, the largest single military force ever assembled on the North American continent up to that day. About 6,000 were British regulars, including some of the most storied units in the Army. The 42nd Highland Regiment of Foot, the legendary Black Watch, alongside the 27th, 44th, 46th, and Howe's own 55th, the Royal Americans, and Colonel Thomas Gage's brand new 81st Regiment of Light Armed Foot, dressed in brown for the forest, a whole regiment built on Howe's new philosophy. The rest, some 9,000 and more, were provincials, militia raised from New York, New England, and New Jersey, including hardened light infantry units like the Jersey Blues, stripped of heavy packs and trained to fight in the loose, quick style the country demanded. At dawn on July 5th, 1758, this army took to the water, and the sight of it passed immediately into legend. 900 heavy flat-bottomed bateaux, 135 swift whaleboats, heavy flatboats groaning under the weight of the siege artillery, the very cannon that could reduce Carillon's flawed walls to rubble. The flotilla launched out onto the mirror-still waters of Lake George and spread until it stretched for 7 miles. End to end, so densely packed that French scouts watching from the heights reported they could not see the surface of the lake between the boats. Only an endless carpet of men and timber sliding north. Bagpipes of the Black Watch skirled off the mountain walls. Regimental colors snapped in the morning air. The sun climbed over the Adirondacks and lit the whole vast pageant of empire on the move. To the men in the boats, it felt like invincibility made visible. It felt like nothing on earth could stop them. But the wilderness had already begun to exact its quiet toll in the mundane form of friction. The fleet was enormous and unwieldy, and it moved slowly. By 5 in the evening on that first day, the Armada had covered only 25 miles and was forced to halt at Sabbath Day Point to let the lumbering artillery and baggage boats catch up. Impatient, Abercrombie pushed the exhausted rowers onward through the night. A dangerous gamble in waters where a naval ambush could have wrought havoc. By the morning of July 6th, the army had reached the northern end of the lake and began to spill ashore in a chaotic, disordered disembarkation at a place that would come to be called Howe's Landing. A name that was, at that moment, still only a place and had not yet become an epitaph. The moment the army left the water, the wilderness swallowed it. As the columns pushed inland along the west bank of the La Chute River, toward Fort Carillon a few miles off, they entered forest so dense and so trackless that the meticulous order of the disembarkation dissolved within minutes. The canopy closed overhead. Visibility dropped to a few yards in any direction. The neat British columns, the pride of Howe's new drilling, disintegrated into a bewildered, groping maze of men blundering through underbrush, losing contact with the units beside them, unsure even of the direction of the fort they were marching on. 16,000 men, and each one could see almost nothing. And moving through that same blind labyrinth, from the opposite direction, came trouble. A French reconnaissance detachment, 350 men strong, under a captain named Louis-Joachim de Trepezec, had been operating south of the British landing site. When the vast British army came ashore, Trepezec's force was suddenly cut off from Fort Carillon, stranded on the wrong side of the enemy. Trepezec did the only thing he could. He tried to march his men in a wide arc through the deep woods to slip around the British and back into the safety of the fort's lines. At around 4 in the afternoon on July 6th, in the dense brush near the confluence of the La Chute and Burnet's Brook, and here is the thing that should raise the hair on your neck, the two forces blundered directly into each other. Burnet's Brook is another name for Trout Brook, the same brook, a few miles down its length, along whose frozen course Rogers' Rangers had been ambushed and cut to pieces just 4 months before. The corridor was collecting its second British disaster along the very same thread of water. A French sentry, hearing movement in the brush, called out the challenge, "Qui vive?" Who goes there? Major Israel Putnam, the tough Connecticut Ranger moving at the head of the British party, allegedly called back Français, French, a desperate bluff to buy a moment. The bluff failed. The French saw through it instantly and opened fire, and the woods erupted. What followed was a savage, close-range blind melee in the brush. Men firing at muzzle flashes a few yards away, unable to see the enemy or their own comrades. The whole fight a chaos of smoke and screaming in the green dark. And into that chaos, from the front, came Lord Howe. Howe was doing what Howe always did, leading from the very front, on foot, at the head of the vanguard, rushing toward the sound of the guns to support the engaged Connecticut provincials rather than directing from safety in the rear. He plunged into the firefight beside Captain Alexander Moneypenny of his own 55th Regiment. And in the first minutes of that meaningless little skirmish in the trees, a French musket ball found him. The ball struck Lord Howe in the chest. It tore through his lungs and his heart and shattered his spine. Captain Moneypenny, standing barely 6 yards away, watched it happen. Watched the 33-year-old Viscount, the soul of the army, the one man who understood how to win this war, fall backward into the underbrush. His hands quivered for an instant, Moneypenny said. And then he was still. Lord Howe was dead before his body settled into the leaves. The soldiers around him, seeing their idol fall, went berserk. Enraged past reason, the British and colonial troops fell on Trepezec's trapped detachment with unrestrained savagery, enveloping it in the brush and killing or capturing nearly 200 Frenchmen. Trepezec himself was mortally wounded and would die the next day. On the ledger of the skirmish, it was a clear British victory. An entire French reconnaissance force destroyed for relatively light loss. And it was, at the same time, one of the most catastrophic things that happened to the British in the entire war, because the relatively light loss included the only irreplaceable man in the army. As one British officer wrote, in a line that has echoed down 2.5 centuries, "In Lord Howe, the soul of General Abercrombie's army seemed to expire." Officers who served with him called him the brains of the army. And now, in an instant, the brains were gone. The campaign that had already lost so many of its best woodsmen on the frozen brook in March had now, by a single random musket ball, lost the one man who understood how to fight in these woods at all. There is a small, grim coda. The summer heat was so intense that Howe's body could not be preserved for the long journey home to England. He was buried in St. Peter's Church in Albany. Local tradition around Ticonderoga long held that his remains were later found beneath a stone bearing a rough, abbreviated inscription, a memorial to Lord Howe, killed at Trout Brook. The same brook, always the same brook. With Howe dead, the great army stopped as if its heart had been cut out. Because, in every way that mattered, it had. Abercrombie, robbed of the subordinate on whom he had leaned for every particle of tactical vision, and possessing almost none of his own, was shattered by the loss and paralyzed by indecision. He did not push forward to seize the initiative while the French were still off balance. He did not press his enormous numerical advantage. Instead, he halted the entire army in its tracks, in the trackless woods, and left 16,000 men to spend a long, miserable night standing under arms in the dark, wet forest, wondering what was happening, waiting for orders that did not come. That hesitation, that single lost day of paralysis and grief and confusion, was the most valuable gift the British could possibly have given their enemy, because a few miles away, behind the flawed walls of a fort he had already decided not to defend, the Marquis de Montcalm was about to be handed the one resource he needed above all others: time. And Montcalm was a man who knew exactly what to do with it. Remember the question that hung over this whole campaign, the one Montcalm had already answered in the privacy of his own mind. If the fort cannot hold, what does? Montcalm's situation was, on paper, hopeless. He commanded roughly 3,600 men, regulars and Canadian militia, against an enemy more than 4 times his strength. His supplies were dangerously low. New France had suffered a poor harvest, food was short, and replacement uniforms and equipment had never reached the garrison. So that Montcalm's regulars would fight this battle in the faded, worn-out clothing of previous years. And the fort behind him, as he knew perfectly well, was a cracked and leaking box that could not survive the British siege guns already floating up the river toward him. To shut himself inside Carillon and wait would be to sign the garrison's death warrant. It would only be a matter of time before Abercrombie's cannon reduced the walls and the whole thing ended in surrender or massacre. So Montcalm made the decision that would define him as one of the finest tactical minds of the age. He would not defend the fort. He would abandon it as a fortress and fight in the open, on ground of his own choosing, where the science of field engineering could do what stone walls could not. About 3/4 of a mile northwest of the fort, a ridge crossed the peninsula, the heights of Carillon. It was high ground. And more than that, it was a natural bottleneck, a place where the neck of land narrowed so that any attacking army had to funnel toward it, unable to bring its full width to bear, unable to simply flow around the flanks. If the British wanted Carillon, they would have to come at this ridge, and they would have to come at it more or less head-on. Montcalm looked at that ridge and saw the answer to his impossible question. He would turn a hill into a fortress in a single day. On July 7th, the very day Abercrombie's army stood paralyzed and grieving in the woods, the entire French army threw down its muskets and picked up axes. What they did in the next 24 hours is one of the most remarkable feats of improvised military engineering in the history of warfare. Along the crest of the ridge, for half a mile, the French built a breastwork, a wall of stacked, notched tree trunks, raised 8 feet high. And here is the crucial detail. Laid out not in a straight line, but in a jagged, zigzagging trace. That zigzag was pure Vauban, pure geometry. It meant that the defenders posted along one section could fire not just forward, but sideways, across the front of the neighboring sections, so that any attacker approaching the wall would be caught in overlapping, intersecting sheets of fire from 2 or 3 directions at once. It was a killing machine designed with a mathematician's cruelty, built out of the forest itself in an afternoon. But the breastwork was only the second half of the trap. The true lethality, the thing that would break the British Army, lay in what the French built in front of it. It was called an abattis, and it was, in effect, the 18th century's answer to barbed wire. The soldiers felled thousands of enormous old-growth trees, the giant virgin timber that had stood on that ground for centuries. And they dropped them outward, downhill, toward the enemy, so that the massive crowns of the trees faced the direction the British would come from. Then they went to work on the branches. They stripped away the leaves and sharpened the thick, interlaced limbs into jagged points, hardening the tips in fire until they were as good as spears. The result was a vast, chest-high, waist-tangling thicket of interwoven, sharpened wood, stretching outward from the breastwork for 30 to 50 yards. An impassable snarl of pointed branches through which no formed body of men could possibly advance. A soldier trying to cross it could not run, could not keep his footing, could not stay with his comrades. He could only claw and stumble through the tangle, one slow, exposed step at a time. And there was a final, diabolical genius to it. Because the abattis was built from the very trees that had grown on that ground, it blended perfectly into the natural forest. From a distance, to a scout squinting through the trees, it did not look like a fortification at all. It looked like a patch of blown-down timber, a natural tangle. It hid the 8-foot log wall behind it completely, so that an approaching enemy could not see the true height and strength of the position he was about to attack. The trap was not just lethal. It was invisible. Behind this wooden fortress, Montcalm arrayed his regiments with a surgeon's precision. He took the center himself, with the Royal Roussillon and Berry battalions. The Chevalier de Lévis, arriving that very evening with a mere 400 reinforcements, took the right flank, commanding the Béarn, Guyenne, and La Reine regiments. Colonel Bourlamaque anchored the left with the La Sarre and Languedoc battalions. The men stood 3 ranks deep on firing steps built into the breastwork, with strict orders to hold their fire, keep their discipline, and shoot down the enemy as he floundered helpless in the timber. The historical record even preserves a small human detail from the embarkation lists. A handful of women were present with the army, 3 permitted per battalion, there for the domestic and logistical labor that kept an 18th century army alive. They too waited on that ridge as the morning of July 8th came on. Everything was ready. The forest had been rebuilt into a weapon. All that remained was for the largest army on the continent to walk into it. And thanks to a young engineer's mistake and a prisoner's lie, that is exactly what it was about to do. On the morning of July 8th, 1758, Abercrombie needed to know what he was facing. So he sent his chief engineer, a young lieutenant named Matthew Clerc, forward to reconnoiter the French position from a distance. Clerc looked at the heights of Carillon across the intervening ground, and he was fooled, exactly as Montcalm had designed him to be fooled. From his vantage point, Clerc could see the tangle of felled timber, but the abattis did its work. It hid the depth and the 8-foot solidity of the breastwork behind it. Clerk did not perceive that he was looking at a completed, formidable fortification. He reported back to Abercrombie that the French works were flimsy, incomplete, that they could be easily forced, even without cannon. Easily forced, even without cannon. It may be the most expensive sentence any engineer ever spoke. And Abercrombie, primed for rashness, seized on it. He was further pushed toward disaster by a piece of false intelligence, extracted from the French prisoners taken during the skirmish that had killed Lord Howe. Those prisoners fed the British command a convincing lie, that a massive French reinforcement, 3,000 fresh men under the Chevalier de Lévis, was about to arrive and swell Montcalm's ranks. In reality, Lévis had already arrived the night before, with just 400 men. But Abercrombie believed the lie, and the lie created a false clock in his head. If a huge reinforcement was coming, then every hour he delayed made the enemy stronger. A patient, methodical siege, the obvious, correct approach against a fortified position, suddenly seemed too slow. He convinced himself he had to strike now, immediately, before the phantom reinforcements arrived. And so James Abercrombie made the decision that would consign his name to infamy. He ordered an immediate, full-scale frontal infantry assault on the heights of Carillon. And, this is the part that beggars belief, he ordered it made without artillery. His heavy siege guns, the very cannon that had been floated up the entire length of Lake George at enormous effort precisely to smash French fortifications, were left sitting on flatboats down on the La Chute River. They would play almost no part in the battle. He also ignored the other options laid before him by the ground itself. He could have hauled cannon up the summit of Mount Defiance, the very hill that overlooked and dominated the whole position, and rained plunging fire down onto the French line. He could have attempted a wider flanking maneuver to turn Montcalm out of his works. He did neither. He chose the one course of action that surrendered every advantage his 16,000 men possessed and pitted naked infantry against a hidden wall of sharpened wood. Montcalm had built the trap. Abercrombie, with his eyes open, marched his army into it. At noon on July 8th, the British assault began, and within an hour, the largest army in North America was being fed, piece by piece, into a wood chipper. Abercrombie had planned a single massive coordinated blow to fall across the whole French line at 1 o'clock. But command and control, already fragile in that blind forest, broke down almost at once. Instead of one crushing hammer stroke, the attack devolved into a series of piecemeal, unsupported charges. Individual regiments hurling themselves at different sectors of the line at different moments, so that Montcalm's defenders could concentrate their fire on each wave in turn and shatter it before the next arrived. And every one of those charges ran into the abatis. The men would advance in good order, muskets ready, dressed in their lines. And then they would hit the wall of sharpened timber, and everything Howe had drilled into them, all the discipline and cohesion, would come apart against the wood. Formations broke on the branches like waves on a reef. Men found themselves trapped in the tangle, unable to go forward through the interwoven spikes, unable to go back through the press of men behind them, unable even to keep their feet. They became, in an instant, static targets, stationary, exposed, floundering in the timber. And from behind the 8-foot log wall 30 yards away, the French infantry, in perfect fire discipline, 3 ranks deep, poured a continuous, methodical, plunging fire into the writhing mass of red and blue caught in the branches. In the center, Captain François Médard Poulary of the Royal Roussillon flung his elite grenadiers into the fiercest of it, throwing back charge after charge in the very heart of the line. For 6 hours it went on. 6 hours. And through all of it, Abercrombie was not there. The general who had ordered this assault watched almost none of it. He remained far to the rear, in a sawmill, entirely out of sight of the battlefield he had set aflame, issuing orders based on reports, funneling fresh regiments forward into the meat grinder without ever seeing with his own eyes what became of them. Wave after wave went up the slope into the timber, and wave after wave was cut down, and the man responsible sat where he could not see the wall of dead accumulating in the abatis. The British did try to break the deadlock. Around 1 o'clock, a flotilla of barges pushed up the La Chute River in an attempt to flank the French position by water, carrying 2 6-pounder cannon and a Royal howitzer, a belated, desperate bid to bring some artillery to bear. The French gunners in the fort blew the barges out of the water. The flanking attempt died on the river in minutes, and the infantry in the timber were left to their fate. The most terrible and the most famous fighting of that terrible day fell on the French right, and it belonged to the Highlanders. Around 2 in the afternoon, the 42nd Highland Regiment of Foot, the Black Watch, was thrown into the assault. And what those Scots did in the abatis passed straight into legend. Wielding their broad-bladed claymores and their bayonets, screaming their Gaelic war cries, the Highlanders hacked and clawed their way into the sharpened timber with a suicidal, almost incomprehensible bravery, enduring murderous crossfire from the Lorraine and Béarn regiments as they came. A handful of them actually reached the breastwork itself, climbing onto one another's shoulders to scale the 8-foot wall of logs, only to be bayoneted the instant they came over the top, tumbling back dead onto their comrades below. They could not be stopped by fear, because they had already, many of them, given themselves up for dead. And there is a reason for that. And it is one of the strangest stories in all of military history. The 42nd's commander was a Highland major named Duncan Campbell of Inverell. And Duncan Campbell had come to Ticonderoga carrying a prophecy. The story, and I want to be clear that this is documented legend, told and retold for centuries, not something we can verify with a witness, runs like this. Years before, back in his castle at Inverell in the Scottish Highlands, Campbell had given shelter to a stranger fleeing in the night, and had sworn on his honor to protect him. Only afterward did Campbell learn the terrible truth. The man he had sworn to shelter was the murderer of his own kinsman. Bound by the sacred and inviolable laws of Highland hospitality, a code older and stronger than the law of the crown, Campbell could not bring himself to hand the killer over. And so, the legend says, the ghost of his murdered kinsman came to him in the dark, bloodied and accusing, and berated him for harboring the murderer, and left him with a single cryptic prophecy before vanishing. Farewell, Inverell, till we meet again at Ticonderoga. Ticonderoga. Campbell had never heard the word. It meant nothing to him, a strange, foreign, unpronounceable sound, with no place in a Scottish Highlander's world. For years he carried it, uneasy, uncomprehending. And then he sailed to America, and marched up the Lake George corridor with the great expedition, and learned at last the Mohawk name of the French fort his army was about to attack, the place between the waters. Ticonderoga, the word from the ghost's mouth. On the morning of the assault, men said, Duncan Campbell was ashen-faced, a man who had finally understood where and how he was going to die. And the prophecy kept its appointment. Campbell's arm was shattered by a musket ball in the bloody charge through the abatis. He was carried from the field, and he died of the wound 9 days later, and was buried far from Inverell, in the earth of a country whose name had haunted him across an ocean. Whatever you make of the ghost, the Black Watch's suffering was brutally real. The regiment lost over 300 men killed, including 8 officers, and a comparable number wounded. Well over half its combat strength gone in a single afternoon, a huge fraction of all the blood the British would shed that day. The Highlanders had been magnificent, and it had bought them nothing but graves. By 7 in the evening, after 6.5 hours and 6 separate futile assaults across the breadth of the French line, the largest army in North America had been bled white. The abattis was choked with the dead and the dying. Red coats and provincial blue tangled in the sharpened branches, men who had been alive and confident at noon, now heaped in the timber they could never cross. Every assault had failed. Every regiment fed into the grinder had come back out broken, or not at all. And at last, far too late for the thousands already fallen, Abercrombie gave the order to retreat. The retreat did not stay orderly for long. It curdled into panic, and then into rout. A rumor swept through the exhausted, shattered ranks that Montcalm was launching a great counterattack, pouring down off the ridge to fall on them. And though it was false, the terror was real, and it broke what discipline remained. Men flung away their muskets, their equipment, even their shoes, and ran. 16,000 soldiers, or what was left of them, stampeded back through the woods toward the boats at the lake in a frenzy of fear, trampling one another, abandoning everything, fleeing an enemy that was in no condition to chase them and had not stirred from its works. By the evening of July 9th, the shattered armada had rowed all the way back down Lake George to the ashes of Fort William Henry, where the whole grand pageant had begun just 4 days before. They had fled from an enemy a quarter their size, and that enemy had never once left the top of its hill. The numbers, when they were tallied, were staggering, and, as always in this war, contested. Abercrombie's own returns put his losses at just under 2,000. By the usual reckoning, more than 500 killed, some 1,350 wounded, and dozens missing. But other accounts, drawn from the grim work of recovering the bodies left in the abattis after the British had fled, placed the British dead alone at around 1,000. The discrepancy is the familiar one. A defeated commander has every reason to soften the figures, and a victorious enemy walking the field has every reason to count generously. The honest answer is that somewhere between 2,000 and 2,500 British and provincial soldiers were killed or wounded in 6 hours in front of a wall of trees. Montcalm's brilliant defense had cost the French only 377 men, all told, in the main battle. A casualty ratio of something like 6 or 7 to 1, inflicted by the smaller force. It was one of the most lopsided defeats in the whole history of British arms. And it was more than lopsided. The Battle of Carillon was, by the count of the dead, the bloodiest single day of combat ever fought on the North American continent. And it would hold that terrible distinction for more than a century, until the carnage of the American Civil War, whose worst days, Antietam among them, finally surpassed it. For over a century, the deadliest day this continent had ever seen was the day the largest army in its history was slaughtered in front of a hill it never reached, by an enemy it never saw clearly, on ground where 4 months earlier its scouts had already died. 10,000 miles of ocean separated London from this stream in the woods, and the empire that ruled a quarter of the world had sent its greatest colonial army all that distance to be broken in an afternoon by trees. In the immediate aftermath, the Marquis de Montcalm did something revealing. He did not build a monument to his own genius. He had a great wooden cross raised on the battlefield, and on it he had inscribed a line giving the credit for the victory not to himself, not to his engineers or his regiments, but to God, a soldier's acknowledgement, perhaps, of just how improbable the thing he had pulled off truly was. A force outnumbered more than 4 to 1, half-starved, dressed in rags, had shattered the greatest army the continent had ever produced. Men reach for the divine when the arithmetic runs out, The strategic consequences ran in two directions at once. For France, Carillon was a miracle that bought a year of life. The victory electrified French morale across New France and, more concretely, single-handedly delayed the collapse of the colony by an entire campaign season. Without it, the Lake Champlain corridor would have been forced open in 1758 and Montreal exposed a full year sooner. Montcalm had reached into a hopeless situation and stolen 12 months for a doomed empire. For Britain, and for James Abercrombie, it was the end. The scale and the stupidity of the defeat destroyed his career outright. He was recalled to England in disgrace, his brief tenure as commander-in-chief remembered only for the catastrophe in the Timber. In his place came General Geoffrey Amherst, a methodical, patient, unglamorous soldier who represented everything Abercrombie was not. And the following year, in 1759, Amherst came back up the same corridor toward the same fort, and did the obvious thing, the thing Abercrombie had refused to do. He brought up his artillery. He prepared to besiege the position properly, to batter it with the guns that Carillon's flawed walls could never withstand, and, if need be, to seize the heights that overlooked it. Faced with a competent siege they could not survive and could not supply, the French did not wait to be slaughtered. They abandoned Fort Carillon and blew it up as they left. The British renamed the shattered fort Ticonderoga. The corridor, at last, was open, and the road to the fall of New France ran through it. Montcalm's miracle had bought exactly 1 year, and not a day more. War remembers commanders and forgets soldiers, and this battle is no exception. But let us follow a few of them out of the smoke. Robert Rogers, the man who slid, or did not slide, down the frozen cliff, survived the war that had tried so hard to kill him on the ice. His Rangers were rebuilt, and he went on to further fame and a strange, turbulent, ultimately unhappy life. His name attached forever to the ranging tradition he codified, a set of hard rules still studied by soldiers who have never heard of Trout Brook. Israel Putnam, who tried the bluff at Burnett's Brook, lived to become one of the celebrated American generals of the Revolution that was still 2 decades away. A British provincial officer at Carillon, who would one day fight the British at Bunker Hill. James Abercrombie vanished into the obscurity his defeat had earned him. Nabbycrombie to the last, a cautionary tale in a red coat. The Marquis de Montcalm, the architect of the miracle, had barely more time than the year he had bought. In 1759, on the Plains of Abraham outside Quebec, he was mortally wounded in the battle that decided the fate of New France, dying within hours of his British opponent James Wolfe. The two commanders expiring almost together in the collapse of a French empire that Carillon had prolonged but could not save. The Chevalier de Lévis, who had come up with his 400 men, fought on to the bitter end and would win the last French victory of the war before the colony fell for good. And the two men the whole tragedy turns on both lie in American ground, far from home. Lord Howe, the soul of the army, killed by a chance ball in a skirmish that his side won, buried in Albany in the summer heat because he could not be carried home. And Duncan Campbell of Inverell, who heard a foreign word from a ghost in a Scottish castle, and came at last to the place it named, buried in the earth of Fort Edward. The prophecy kept. The appointment at Ticonderoga tragically fulfilled. Now, at the end, we can go back to where we started, to the frozen lake ambush that destroyed the largest British army. The story, as popular memory tells it. That memory is wrong, and it is wrong in an instructive way. It fuses 2 separate battles, 4 months and a whole change of season apart, into a single dramatic image. The frozen lake ambush, the battle on snowshoes, happened in March, in the ice and the deep snow. And it destroyed not an army, but a reconnaissance patrol of 180 men. The destruction of the largest British army happened in July, in the summer heat. Not on any frozen lake at all, but on a dry ridge. Not by ambush, but by a frontal assault its own commander ordered against a wall of trees. Memory has smeared them together into one great, frozen lake ambush. And in doing so, it gets nearly every detail wrong. And yet, and this is why the mistake is worth examining rather than just correcting, memory stumbles onto a truth its own errors obscure. The two battles are connected, not as one event, but by the ground and by the flaw. Both were fought along the same brook, Trout Brook, in the same few miles of wilderness. And both grew from the same British failing. The failure to see, to know the ground, to scout the enemy, to read the trap before walking into it. In March, it destroyed a patrol that had been sent, under strength, into country everyone suspected was watched. In July, it destroyed an army that pushed blind through trackless forest, that had rebuilt its rangers but did not use them to screen the advance, that lost the one commander who understood these woods to a chance ball, and that finally hurled itself at a wall of trees an engineer had failed to see for what it was. The frozen lake ambush did not annihilate the army that died at Carillon. Rogers lived, and his rangers rode again. What binds the two disasters is not one destroyed unit, but one repeated mistake, made twice on the same brook, the second time on a scale that cost an empire its greatest army on the continent. The popular memory is wrong in almost every fact and right in its deepest instinct. These deaths belong to the same story. 2.5 centuries later, this campaign is still studied, and it still teaches, because the lessons buried in it do not depend on muskets or snowshoes. They are timeless. The first lesson is that reconnaissance is sight itself, and that sight is worth nothing if an army will not use it or heed it. The British lost 125 of their best scouts on the frozen brook in March. Then, in July, with Rangers once more in the ranks, they pushed blind through trackless forest anyway, failed to screen their marching columns, blundered headlong into the enemy, and finally trusted an engineer who could not see a wall of felled trees for the fortress it concealed. The failure was never simply a shortage of eyes. It was an army that, again and again, would not look before it moved. Modern militaries build enormous, expensive systems around a single obsession: to see the battlefield before the enemy does. Precisely because the price of blindness is written in stories like this one. The second lesson is that engineering can be a weapon more powerful than numbers. Montcalm did not win at Carillon with more men or better muskets. He won with axes and trees and 24 hours and a geometric understanding of how to make ground kill. The abatis negated the entire British numerical advantage and turned an open assault into a static massacre. It is the same principle that would run through the trench lines of the First World War, that runs through every fortified position and prepared defense ever since. The side that shapes the ground can defeat the side that merely occupies it. Terrain, properly engineered, is force. It multiplies the weak and it swallows the strong. The third lesson is the danger of hubris armored in rank. Abercrombie had every material advantage: numbers, artillery, high ground available for the taking, time enough for a proper siege. He threw it all away because a young engineer misjudged a wall of trees and a prisoner told a convenient lie, and because a mind unequal to its command reached for the fastest answer instead of the right one. He did not even watch his own battle. History is full of Abercrombies, commanders whose confidence in their advantages blinds them to the trap, who mistake motion for decision and refuse the slow, correct, unglamorous course. Superior force guarantees nothing in the hands of a man who will not think. And the fourth lesson is the cruelest and the most human. that everything can turn on a single man and a single instant. Lord Howe had built the one instrument capable of fighting and winning this kind of war. And had he lived, the assault on Carillon might never have been ordered, or might have been ordered with sense. One French musket ball in a meaningless skirmish erased him, and with him erased the only mind in that army equipped to adapt to the wilderness. Battles are decided by systems and by numbers and by engineering. But they are also, always, decided by fragile, mortal, irreplaceable human beings. And the loss of one of them at the wrong moment can doom 16,000. There is no doctrine that fully insures against that. There is only the terrible arithmetic of chance. We began on the ice, with a single shot fired across a frozen brook, and we should end there, back at the ground itself. Because in the end, this whole story belongs to the ground. Ticonderoga, the place between the waters. The Mohawk named it for what it was: a narrow passage, a choke point, a hinge. And for one blood-soaked year, that name became a kind of curse. In March, the corridor took 125 rangers and gave them frozen graves in the snow along Trout Brook. In July, a few miles down that same brook, it took Lord Howe, and then it took 2,000 more men in front of a wall of trees not far away. The same brook, the same few miles of wilderness, swallowed 2 British disasters in a single turning of the seasons. And the thread that ran between them was the forest. The snow and the timber in the winter, the sharpened branches and the summer heat in the July that followed. The British kept fighting the wrong war in the wrong place, and Montcalm at Carillon simply gave the forest an axe and pointed it downhill. Today, the ruins of the fort still stand on their rocky peninsula in northern New York, rebuilt and restored, visited by tourists who walk the quiet ground where the largest army on the continent came apart. There is a battlefield where the abatis stood, grown back into ordinary trees. And there is a deeper irony the ground still carries. For the place between the waters was not finished making history. Less than 2 decades after the slaughter in the timber, this same fort would fire the opening act of an entirely new war. In May of 1775, at the very outset of the American Revolution, Ethan Allen and his Green Mountain Boys, with a young Benedict Arnold at their side, seized Ticonderoga from its small, sleeping British garrison in a bloodless dawn surprise, the first offensive victory of that revolution. And through the following winter, a Boston bookseller turned soldier named Henry Knox performed one of the great logistical feats in American history. He dragged some 60 tons of the fort's captured cannon on ox-drawn sledges across the frozen mountains and the iced-over rivers, all the way to Boston, where those guns, planted on the heights overlooking the harbor, forced the British Army to abandon the city. The heavy artillery that Abercrombie had been too rash to use at this fort in 1758 would, hauled once more through the snow, help win a new nation its freedom. The ground remembered. It always does. There is a frozen lake in winter and a cliff called Roger's Slide, and somewhere a stone that once marked where Lord Howe fell at Trout Brook. The snow that killed the Rangers melts every spring. The trees that broke the Black Watch have long since fallen and rotted and grown again. And the water still runs, as it always did, between the 2 lakes, through the place the Mohawk named, patient and indifferent, and utterly unimpressed by empires. The largest British army in North America marched into that narrow country, certain it could not be stopped. It was stopped by a general with a quarter of its numbers, a hill, and a single day's work with an axe. And the lesson it left behind, written in the deadliest ground this continent would know for 100 years, is the same lesson the frozen brook had already tried to teach in March, and the same one that waits, still, for every army arrogant enough to believe that numbers are destiny. Sometimes the terrain is the enemy. Sometimes the forest fights back. And sometimes the place between the waters keeps everything that walks into it.